It's the third lecture and the final one of our very dear guest friend and professor, Michael Roof. It's called Belle Knox and the Making of the Indebted Woman. For those who watch porn, they are quite aware who Belle Knox is. She was also quite popular on TV. I think she even had an interview in CNN and stuff like this. So no, I won't get into it. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Artan, and thank you to all of you again for coming to the last lecture. I forgot my glasses, so I'll be squinting a lot. You could make some sort of joke about we're watching porn and I'm squinting. Oh my bad eyesight. So, also, I started writing this in Lacania, is that the name of the bar? Last night, so I started writing it there, and I finished writing it today, so it will have a sort of polemical and less theoretical feel than the previous two lectures. So my style may be a little bit different than in the previous two. I was also writing it right up until Artan came to collect me, so I texted my brother. He said, "Good luck for your bell lecture." And I wrote back and said, like, Artan rang the bell as I was writing the last few words, and he said, "He knocked on the door." Okay, so there'll be lots of puns in this probably. Okay, so Belle Knox and the Making of the Indebted Woman. And I'm going to look at in this talk the writings particularly of Belle Knox, who has become infamous.
So that you feel more comfortable that I don't read while we talk.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'm going to be looking at the writings of the now infamous or famous porn star, and she's also a Duke University student who's majoring in women's studies. I think she's also taking law. Her real name, Miriam Weeks, her porn star name, Belle Knox. Mostly I refer to her as Knox, unless she's written something as Miriam Weeks, or it becomes important to use her real name. And in particular, I want to talk about what she calls the strata of sex work, or the hierarchy. So I'm calling it the strategies of whoreification, but the term hierarchy is hers. So I'm going to consider how she updates the feminist work of Gayle Rubin, who drew this charmed circle of what she called good and bad sex. And that was really influential for the early development in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s of feminist and gender studies, but really, really influential on what became sexuality studies and queer theory. So I want to ask in this lecture what the contribution of a popular figure like Belle Knox might actually be to feminist thought, but also to the future of feminism and the future of queer thought. And I particularly want to ask that question around certain issues to do with sex, work, precarity, dispossession, and heteronormativity. So a little bit of an intro, a bit of foreplay with Belle on the couch. So for those of you who don't know her, is there anyone who hadn't heard of her prior to this? No, everybody had heard of her. Yeah.
Well, I heard last night, so...
Yeah, okay. Well, for those of you who don't, which you all now know her, Belle Knox, or Miriam Weeks, is a 19-year-old American woman who's a freshman at Duke University. She started last year and she's taking women's studies, as I said, but she began to work in porn because she couldn't pay her tuition fees, which were $60,000 per year. Okay, so sometime later, after deciding to work porn in order to pay her fees, one of her fellow students saw one of her scenes, approached her and said, "I've seen you, I know you work porn," and she said, "Please don't say anything." But he outed her, and it then went viral. And that catapulted her into the public eye. So rather than me speaking for her, I'm going to let Belle introduce herself. This clip is from actually one of her first filmed porn scenes, and it's quite typical of the genre in that it's a casting couch scene.
You can control it.
Okay. kind of interesting to watch that in terms of the fact that she wasn't yet known to anybody outside of that room, really, at that point. And she's talking about being a closet freak, and of course she subsequently gets outed. So there's a sort of interesting retroactive queer discourse about outing involved there. But it's also atypical of the porn casting couch genre in that she's arguing for the societal obligation to vaccinate, for example, which one doesn't ordinarily hear in the early opening pitch of someone who wants to get into porn. So, get off that page. And just put up Belle's Twitter in case we suddenly get inspired to tweet her.
Yeah, I started following her.
Good, yeah. I'm just going to put that up to have something up there. Right. Okay, so that's Belle introduced to us. So later on in this particular scene, I didn't want to show all of it, Belle tells the male interviewer, who as you've gathered is quite sexist and dismissive of her. But she tells him that she's a women's studies student and that it's her hope that she would eventually become a human rights lawyer. So again, this is atypical. She's setting out to become a porn star, but she's telling him that ultimately what she wants to be is someone who's fighting for human rights, but particularly for women's rights. So the interviewer is understandably perplexed as to why she wants to make such a career choice. And she says that the key issue for her is equal pay between men and women. And that even in the porn industry, this one that she's chosen, there is unequal pay between men and women. Which isn't necessarily true for porn stars, actually, because the women are better paid. But there are strategies, there are scales even within that, which I'll mention. But of course, the porn industry is largely male directors, male casting couch people, and so on. It's the actors who don't earn, male actors who don't earn very much. So her argument for wanting to get into human rights law is ultimately on the platform of equal rights for men and women in terms of how they're remunerated for their work. Okay. He responds quite dismissively that men are better negotiators, and that's more or less when he tells her to take her clothes off. So it tells you something about the male narrative that's going on in there, and a different kind of narrative about equality that Belle is trying to propagate. However, in response to the subsequent outing, after the scene we've been watching, she has, in the sense that the outing was unchosen, she's chosen very, very positively and very bravely, I think, to use this newfound publicity or publicness, despite persistent death threats, rape threats, threats of violence, her Twitter being hacked, her Facebook being hacked. I assume her family have also been targeted. They certainly have in the newspapers. So even in the face of all of that, she's chosen the fact that she's become this famous or quasi-famous figure to highlight or to illuminate issues to do with student debt, work, sex work particularly, precarity, equality, and the broad issue of human rights. So she's even an advocate for human rights on the Duke University campus. So given how prominent she's become very quickly, subject of a 5-part documentary on US television, which Biljana watched all 5 episodes of last night. She's been a guest on numerous high-profile American TV shows. She's been interviewed by pretty much every high-profile American TV chat show host. She's also the host herself of an American TV show, which is like a reality search for a porn star, and it's called The Sex Factor. So she's a co-host on that. She's also had her story fictionalized in an episode of Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which is called Porn's Requiem, which starts off really mimicking her story of how she got into porn, how she then does a rough sex scene first, as her first scene, and then how she gets outed by a fellow student. And then the rest of the narrative isn't necessarily about her, but she had to approve everything in it before it could go live on TV. So this is interesting about how she manages her persona, which I'm going to say a little bit about shortly. And that she has that, not only the intelligence and the forthrightness to say, like, I want to approve this episode before it airs. She's also put herself in a position, using her newfound fame, to become an important voice for particularly young feminist women, I think, for young queer theorists. So she's capitalising on that fame. She's used the platform of being on TV to talk about human rights issues and legal issues to do with pay, to do with sex work and prostitution and so on. But she's also written numerous articles for quite mainstream press. Rolling Stone, she wrote an op-ed piece on prostitution for Rolling Stone. She's been in Time, she's written for Time magazine, she's written for Forbes, she's written for the Huffington Post, and these are very widely read. And this, I think, is a positive thing, that someone is writing an op-ed on prostitutes as being people and not criminals for the Rolling Stone, who I imagine they haven't had issues like that foregrounded for them in the past, which are to do with sex work and the legalisation of prostitution. Or indeed student debt, which she wrote about for Time magazine, student loans. This must be to do with the fact that her family were means tested and she wasn't eligible. It subsequently turns out, according to the press, I don't know if this is true, that her family have taken away any financial aid they were giving her because they didn't know she was doing porn until she was outed. Then she didn't want to apply for any sort of private loans because that would have saddled her parents with debt, with $60,000 of debt, and that's just for 1 year. So she took to making porn, and that was initially unbeknownst to her family, in order to pay her fees. Now she commands up to $1,200 per scene that she shoots, and she doesn't shoot very many, but because she manages her schedule in a particular way, she probably shoots quite a few scenes together, so she earns quite a lot in one outing. Outing in a different sense. I assume though that her fee of $1,200 has actually gone up. You would imagine it would have shot up since she has this almost immediate starlet status. She also does one-on-one Skype shows, which I briefly considered paying the money to have her Skype in on this, which would have been interesting. But I think it's something like $300 for 60 minutes with her. So she makes quite a lot of money from that. She also makes money from merchandise, and she offers what's called a dream girl service, which is, I assume she doesn't actually do any of the work that's involved in this. It's probably farmed out to somebody else, but it's a text and SMS and phone service where you get a phone number and you can call Belle Knox. I assume you're not talking to Belle Knox, since you would have to be available 24 hours a day to answer phone calls and text messages from hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. But she also makes money from that. And there's also a thing called Snap Girls, which is she sends photos to people and they pay for them. Now I'm assuming that she makes quite a bit of money from all of these products, which people are eager to consume, but you can imagine, even in terms of the argument she's making with the casting couch guy, that her agents actually make the bulk of the money. They get the largest slice of the cake from each of these services. So the fact still would remain that she would be able to meet her tuition costs. And she has now returned to Duke after a brief hiatus in her student career. She's back in class now, which she's been tweeting about in the last week or so. She said she was getting fucked in the library, but not in a good way, which I take it means she forgot to return some of her books. Now, prior to doing porn, or choosing to do porn, Miriam had worked as a waitress, and she was earning $400 a week, very meagre for her, and she was treated very poorly by her boss, male, unsurprisingly, who was insisting that she work shifts that would conflict with her college schedule. So she decided that if she did porn, she would have more of an affordance in terms of time to do her studies, and that she would have more financial as well as temporal agency. And she would be earning 3 times in one shoot what she would get in a whole week for waitressing. The other thing in terms of managing her temporal schedule was that she was able to organise her classes, attending her classes around doing her porn work. So she would fly to LA during breaks in the Duke schedule, from North Carolina to LA. It turns out that subsequently, after she was out of Duke, withdrew all her financial aid. And again, very courageously, she wrote about this in Time magazine, that a major public university had taken away her funding simply because she was doing other work outside of her studies, which they wouldn't have if she were working as a lawyer, say. Okay. Now, the Time magazine article is actually written under her own name. She writes with Miriam Weeks again. A hugely courageous thing to take on your university. And I'll say a bit more about Duke's position on this shortly. And this is the same magazine, Time, which completely infantilized her. Someone wrote an article in Time saying, oh, she's just a confused little girl. She doesn't know what she wants. If she thinks porn is empowering, then she's just a stupid little thing who doesn't know better, and she's going to ruin her life. So she responded to that infantilization by saying, I'll write an article for Time, and she did. And she's good at it, as she says herself. She's good at debating. So the title I gave to this talk was The Making of the Indebted Woman. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end of the talk today about what I call, after Gayle Rubin, the sexual rabble of which she's now a part. But we might see her in terms of her economic situation and her indebtedness as part of what, since the economic and financial and fiscal crisis, we could call the economic rabble. Okay, so it's the sexual rabble is all those outsiders, the economic rabble is a different set of outsiders. What we're witnessing since the financial crisis in 2008 and the numerous uprisings since then is a resurrection of Marx and Engels' category of the rabble, who are engaged in emancipatory struggles and in arguments for an extension of the category of the worker. Now, Frederick Jameson, in his book Valences of the Dialectic, has argued that in Marx's Capital, the structure of unemployment is fundamental, and that unemployment is structurally inseparable from the dynamic of accumulation and expansion, which constitutes the very nature of capitalism as such. Now, according to Marx, it is the very success of capitalism that produces unemployment, and that makes more generalised the threat of unemployment or threatened uselessness. So the world market, Jameson says, has become a space in which everyone has once been a productive labourer, and in which labour has everywhere begun to price itself out of the system. So with this ongoing dynamic of capitalist globalisation, the very category of unemployment now includes, this is a quote from Jameson, those massive populations around the world who have, as it were, dropped out of history, who have been deliberately excluded from the modernising projects of first world capitalism and written off as hopeless or terminal cases. So this new scale of the unemployed thus now encompasses, as Zizek writes in Trouble in Paradise, the wide span of population from the temporarily unemployed through to the no longer employable and the permanently unemployed, up to people living in slums and other types of ghettos, all those others dismissed by Marx as lumpen proletarians, and finally entire areas, populations and states excluded from the global capitalist process. So this new diagramming of the worker under global capitalism leads, as Belle Knox is well aware in her writing, to an entire cognitive remapping of our situation. It also opens a space, potentially, for agents of emancipatory struggle, including Belle Knox herself as a sex worker and a student. Now, Jameson proposes that there are three types of worker, or three types of category under this global capitalist regime. One are workers, labourers. Two are the reserve army of the temporarily unemployed. Three are the permanently unemployable. It's noteworthy, I think, that a lot of commentators on Belle Knox have said, like, okay, so she's working porn now, but she's more or less ruined herself for any future employment. Okay, so she's actually, you know, securing her own potential unemployability in the future, or sabotaging her chance of having a future as a worker. And the fourth category for Jameson is the formerly employed but now unemployed Belle, which her detractors are saying she'll end up in that fourth category. Now, Zizek adds a fifth term to this Grimasian square, and that is the illegally unemployed. That's those working in black markets and slums, up to different forms of slavery. Now, the black markets would, or the category of the illegally employed would probably actually include a lot of sex workers. Now, not Belle Knox, because the industry in LA is, of course, all legal and above board. But the illegally unemployed would include different types of sex worker, and the illegally unemployed that are slaves would include sex workers who of course are trafficked. Okay. Now, Zizek also proposes that Jameson's third category of the formerly unemployed should be supplanted by its opposite, what he calls the educated unemployed. Okay. So Zizek says, today a whole generation of students has almost no chance of finding appropriate employment, something which leads to massive protest. These unemployable students are destined to play a key organising role in the forthcoming emancipatory movements. Radical change is never triggered by the poor alone. The addition of a generation of unemployable, educated youth, combined with widely available modern digital technology, offers the prospect of a properly revolutionary situation. So Knox is part of that sort of temporarily educated future unemployable. Okay? Just to supplant Zizek's category with another term. Now, my title, Belle Knox and the Making of the Indebted Woman, it plays on two senses of the idea of the making of the indebted woman. It's a reference both to the way that Belle Knox makes something of herself from her position of educated, unemployed woman, or temporarily employed as a waitress, to the making of women and men as indebted subjects. Now, Zizek rightly points out that the spectre of debt is haunting capitalism today, and Maurizio Lazzarato's book, The Making of the Indebted Man, which I've regendered as The Making of the Indebted Woman, interrogates this being towards debt. It's a Heideggerian poem, being towards debt, as in the EBT, that has become a way of life for young people, for all people, really, under global capitalism. But because it's Knox who's my subject, I'm going to talk primarily about young people. Lazzarato, in a wonderful book, it really is a fantastic text, The Spectre of Debt, and how capitalism actually doesn't want to get rid of it, because the way that debt operates across a whole range of social practices and social levels keeps people in their place. Okay, so it's a way of governing not just subjects, but entire nation states. So it goes from nation states down to the individual, someone like Belle Knox. Now, Zizek explains that the hegemonic neoliberal ideology endeavours to extend the logic of market competition to all areas of social life, so that, for example, health and education are perceived as investments made by the individual in his or her individual capital. In this way, the worker is no longer conceived merely as labour power, but as personal capital making good and bad investment decisions as he or she moves from job to job and increases or decreases his or her capital value. It's interesting that under this regime of making people indebted, you make good or bad decisions. Okay, so there's this bifurcation between the good and bad, which I want to talk a lot about later on. So you make economically good or bad decisions. And Knox is all too sharply cognizant of this biopolitical management of the worker, who must become an entrepreneur of the self. We are all entrepreneurs of the self. As Lazzarato puts it, contemporary neoliberal policies produce a human capital or entrepreneur of the self, more or less indebted and more or less poor, but always precarious. For the majority of the population, becoming an entrepreneur of the self is limited to managing one's employability, one's debts, the drop in one's salary and income, and the reduction in social services according to business and competitive norms. In becoming an entrepreneur of the self, as porn star, it is an entrepreneurial move on her behalf, Knox must constantly advertise herself. She must become a walking CD on social media, on her Twitter, although she doesn't use Twitter very much, but if you look at any of the other porn stars on Twitter, they're literally advertising themselves every hour and advertising their services every hour. Knox not so much because she's much more famous. But she has to manage her persona still in a certain way. So it's a new form of self-governance. So you're not just being governed by, governed as a citizen, you're also being governed by yourself, or you're self-governing. And both of those situations are precarious, always precarious, as Lazzarato says. So porn stars are, their cultural capital, as well as their economic capital, is precarious simply because it goes up and down. Their capital rises quickly. They become stars, they become starlets, but then they get older and they're no longer as desirable and they don't make as much money. But also certain sexual practices do not make as much. For example, Belle Knox won't earn as much as other porn stars because she doesn't do certain scenes. For example, she doesn't do anal yet, but anal sex is the best paid. Okay, so if you stretch to do, if you'll pardon the pun, anal sex or gangbangs, you get more money. So Knox is not just indebted as a sex worker, but she's also an indebted student, an indebted consumer. I mean, she has to consume herself too, but she's also providing to other indebted consumers and other indebted workers. She's also an indebted citizen. Now, there is, as Lazzarato and others have argued, a moralizing dimension to the making indebted of the citizen. He or she is made to assume and feel guilt as an indebted subject, precisely for being an indebted subject. So one must be able to gain salaried employment in order to promise to pay and repay, and one must, as Zizek writes, make one's behaviour predictable, regular and calculated. So as we've already seen, Knox must carefully manage her schedule around the life of an indebted student, an indebted waitress, or an indebted porn star. So the indebted subject is tailored to specific temporalities of calculation and regulation, which must not be disrupted or compromised by unpredictable or bad behaviours. And the indebted subject, no more than the porn star on the screen, is constantly surveilled. They're constantly being watched. As Zizek says, they're opened up to the evaluating inspection of others, individualised appraisals and targets at work, credit ratings, individual interviews for those in receipt of benefits or public credits. The subject is thus compelled not only to show that he or she will be able to repay debt and to repay society through the right behaviours, which presumably wouldn't include sex work, but also to show the right attitudes and assume individual guilt for any failings, which presumably wouldn't assume feeling guilt for public criticism of, or it would assume feeling guilt for publicly criticising student debt and the rights of sex workers and students. What Knox is actually doing is engaging in two bad behaviours in that case against this moralising discourse. So despite this compunction to be an entrepreneur of the self, which Knox has certainly become, She is revolted against the curtailments of indebted subjecthood in several ways. 1, she governs her own time. 2, she disrupts the hetero-reproductive temporalities of work. She works when she wants to. 3, she's evaluating her own behaviour and she's defending it publicly. 4, she's acting autonomously, and Duke University cannot expel her, even though the students and perhaps some faculty have threatened to or have asked for her expulsion, but they cannot expel her because her porn work constitutes an off-campus activity. In their book Dead Man Working, Carl Sedestrom and Peter Fleming posit an escape from the deadening inertia of work which has biopolitically colonised the worker subject, so much so that she is always working. She is always working, the porn star is always working, she's always on social media, she's always on Twitter, Instagram, constantly updating. But she's also working even when she's asleep. We might note that the instant messaging SMS service that porn stars offer is called Dream Girls. So they're actually working even when they're dreaming. So the figure they suggest, Sedestrom and Fleming, is one for being one for emancipatory hope, if it is to evade the temporalities of endless work. Is the figure they offer, this hopeful figure, is the little girl, or the child who is on strike. They say that it is only today, however, when the working adult has become a wrecked and unsalvageable project, that the child figure truly assumes a formidable counterforce. So in contradistinction to the Tikkun Collective's denunciation of the little girl in their theory of the young girl, Sedestrom and Fleming glimpse potential in Deleuze-Guattari's becoming child, but especially in becoming girl. We should remember here that Knox has been dismissed as a little girl who couldn't know any better when she said she felt empowered as a young woman by doing porn. So for Sedestrom and Fleming, the little girl represents a withdrawal from power, but becoming a little girl is no easy task. Lateral shifts and manoeuvres are, as Lauren Berlant tells us in Cruel Optimism, both ways out and vectors of escape, but there are also ways in which we can get caught up again in apparatuses of capture. They say that even to imagine withdrawing, which for the little girl seems to come so easily, is a hard thing to do, especially when power is so close to us and so insidious. However, in response to this paralysis of the governed subject worker, Sedestrom and Fleming exhort the little girl, and the little girl can be anyone. The little girl, they say, is not defined by biological age. Its figure is open to anyone of all ages. So the little girl is anyone who resists the inertia of work, of endless work. What they say the little girl should do is to de-work their bodies and social relations, to separate life from that which has colonised it. And this means not mistaking the commonwealth that we produce together for capitalism, not mistaking life and its conduct for work, not mistaking the body and its sensibilities for a human resource. Now, arguably, porn work does all of those things that they say we shouldn't do, in the sense that it works the body rather than de-works it. But in her writing, Knox does try to escape these traps or self-entrapments. But as Berlant would caution, despite Knox's, in Deleuze-Guattari's terms, speed, her freely machinic body, her abstract line of flight, her becoming little girl or her fugitivity is compromised by her very publicness, because the next step after becoming girl for Deleuze-Guattari is becoming imperceptible. And that's a politics which may not be open to Knox because she's very much perceptible, her movement is perceptible, and she can be perceived at all times. However, there is a positive side to all of this. Kathy Weeks, who shares a surname with Miriam Weeks, Belle Knox, she offers us a more hopeful conclusion in her argument for what she calls post-work. She says that one of the potentialities for escaping work is to get a life. Life as a counterpoint to work would evade the politics of biopolitical governance, would be a full life, or as Deleuze would say, an index of multiplicity, the contents of which we would not know in advance. A life, in Deleuze's sense of singularity, is Weeks's, Kathy Weeks this time, She tells us that a life is what each of us needs to get. One cannot get a life if its terms are only dictated from the outside. That said, getting a life is also necessarily collective endeavour. One cannot get something as big as a life on one's own. And moreover, though it is a life that would be ours, as a life rather than a commodity, as a web of relations and qualities of experience rather than a possession, it is not something we can be said precisely to own or even hold. So this kind of getting implies a fundamentally different mode of appropriation or possession. The concept of life is not just expansive in this respect, it's excessive. And clearly Weeks, this time Miriam, is getting a life, insofar as she is arguing against work which reduces, contains, appropriates, and she's arguing against feminist positions which would refuse the pleasures, joys and dangers of the life she has chosen. She's been very consistent about this from the start, with the exception of the first scene she shot. She says she enjoys and takes great pleasure in doing porn. So her work for her is getting a life. So Knox is on the one hand contesting the existing terms of the work society, arguing for legalisation, better conditions, and she's struggling to build something new in terms. Knox's project of getting a life is critically and utopically queer because she wishes to get us out of the quagmire of the present to another differently imagined, always promising, not yet here, but always hoped for future. In a sense, Knox is refusing, or at the very least questioning, the existing world of sex work, or the world of work in general, and demanding an alternative. And for Knox, this is a collective endeavour, since it was really only the queers and feminists, those paratactical minoritarian subjects who rallied around her at Duke after her outing. You can imagine she didn't get much support from the sorority girls or the frat boys. It was the queer and feminist students who shared in this collective resistance with her. As Artan Sadiku put it in Multitude, there are no queer bodies, only queer flesh that resides in the communication and collaboration of social conduct. Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou both recognise this potentiality for collective world making in the queer flesh of the multitude in the face of logics of precarity, dispossession and disposability. They see getting a life, or self-poiesis, self-crafting, self-making, as Knox has in terms of its capacity to disrupt temporalities, but also spatialities of governance, sovereignty, indebtedness and possession. These self-authorising temporalities and spatialities gesture towards new alliances, new forms of life, and new relational modes which are modes of becoming with one another. What Butler and Athanasiou call supra-individual modes that are out of sync with regimes of social regulation and the identitarian apparatus. Okay, so the next section. Thinking sex. Her outing occurred in January 2014, and a month later Knox, under a pseudonym, gave an interview for the Duke College newspaper in which he called attention to the virgin-whore dichotomy in which women are constantly trapped. She then contributed blog posts to the feminist blog XO Jane, in which she again targeted the ways in which women are straitjacketed in roles as either good girls, virgins, or bad girls, whores. So it's like good workers and bad workers. Again, she was met with an onslaught of sexual harassment and obscene abuse on social media. Having already been outed with her name and personal details released, she herself took the opportunity in her second blog posting on XO Jane to reveal her porn name. Belle Knox, Belle from Beauty and the Beast and Secret Diary of a Call Girl, and Knox after the convicted and subsequently exonerated and then retried murderess Amanda Knox. I don't know what her current status is, so we'll say murderess in inverted commas. So far she has escaped this site called Porn WikiLeaks, which leaks the names, addresses, family details, real Facebook pages of family members, real addresses of where shoots are happening, directors' addresses, directors' phone numbers, porn stars' phone numbers, all of these details which put them in extreme physical danger. But Knox has thus far not been targeted by them. So since these early posts, on blogs, which were largely about her outing and the threats of physical beating and rape. She's chosen to write articles for various feminist blogs and magazines, including XO Jane and Jezebel. Many of her articles have been translated from English into other languages. And in those, she's been challenging this pervasive culture of slut-shaming, even within feminism itself. The double standard of virgin and whore, which she had already anatomized in her first pseudonymous interview in the Duke Chronicle, is one she has later gone on to refine in terms of the double standards that sex workers of all kinds face, not only from those who make use of their services, who call them whores, but want them to be virgins, but also within the sex industry itself, and within certain brands of contemporary feminism. So Knox is saying that not only has she been called a slut by the people who consume her products, you would expect her to use that kind of rhetoric, but she's also been called a slut by feminists, and she's also been called a slut by other sex workers. So that is what I want to look at. Now, in terms of what I want to see as the emergence of a fourth wave of feminism in her writing, but two texts by her in particular. So the first text is Tearing Down the Hierarchy from the Inside. Which I'm going to look for now. It's a great coinage. I'm surprised nobody else had used it before. The hierarchy. Okay, so this was on Jezebel. I'll leave it up there so you can have the URL for it. But I'm going to read it because her words are very important in terms of what I want to say later on. So this first text, Tearing Down the Hierarchy from the Inside, and I'm going to argue that this ought to be read alongside Gayle Rubin's hugely influential 1984 text, Thinking Sex, in which she introduced the idea of the charmed circle of sex, which we'll look at a bit in a moment. But first, Knox's article. So, here in her own words again. I expected to be criticised for my work. I'm a porn performer, from my classmates at Duke. But from my fellow strippers, denigrations for sitting on a dick for a living stone, if for no other reason than that I didn't see it coming. I am often asked if there is solidarity among sex workers. The answer is, as I've come to slowly and painfully discover, no. We're all essentially doing the same job, selling tickets to a fantasy. So you might imagine that like retail, food service, which she worked in, or any other profession, we might have some form of solidarity. But what I've learned about the sex work hierarchy, or the whorearchy if you will, has helped shed some light on some of the lies I believe all women are buying to one degree or another. Since filming my first porn scene, I discovered that sex work segregates itself along perceived social and legal lines, ranging from phone sex operation to stripping and porn to prostitution. So it's ranging from the good to the bad. The whorearchy is arranged according to intimacy of conduct with clients and police. The closer to both clients and police you are, the closer you are to the bottom. That puts outdoor workers, i.e. street-walking prostitutes, at the very foundation. They are disdained by indoor prostitutes who find clients online or via other third parties. So they will be escorts. So they are disdained by the strippers and escorts who perform sex acts for clients, who are disdained by those who don't. At the top sit sex workers who have no direct contact with cops or clients, such as cam girls and phone sex operators. Which is incidentally how many of these girls get into doing porn. They initially become well known as a cam girl. Even within porn there is stratification. Women who engage in specifically interracial or edgier scenes are viewed as somehow lower by other performers. I was marginalised within the industry for my work on a rough sex website. I've witnessed colleagues receive racist epithets for their work on interracial productions. Gay or trans performers are particularly ostracised by the mainstream due to the AIDS stigma attached to their work. You've also had outing of gay and trans male performers, particularly as HIV positive. The whole thing is so odd to me. As a feminist, I understand that the hierarchy originates from outdated, pernicious ideas about sex, gender and class. I certainly was taught at a very early age that sex was a sinful, evil act and that women who engaged in sex were promiscuous deviants with mental disturbances. I struggle to overcome the shame I'm supposed to feel about not fulfilling my obviously class-coded potential. We're hardly the only ones suffering from such stratification. All women are taught from an early age through religion, media and socialisation that men do not respect women who are sexual outside of marriage, but require they be hypersexual within it. They want someone they can bring home to their mothers, a lady in the street but a freak in the bed, according to hip-hop artist Ludacris. Be a whore, but be respectable. Be slutty, but not too slutty. Use sexuality to sell perfume, food, clothing, cars, but never ever sell the sex itself. Women who fail to meet these standards will be punished, but of course it's never just about sex. Earlier this month, Slate covered a study showing that rich girls and poor girls use the word slut more to maintain class positions than to accurately describe sexual behaviour. The rich girls use it to keep poor ones in their place, whilst working class women use it as a term of derision seemingly born of envy. So there's even a class hierarchy going on there. What surprises me is that I assumed that if there were any group you'd expect to have shrugged off these ideas, it'd be sex workers. Yet the way we treat each other belies that notion. Instead, it's obvious how firmly the societal shaming of female sexuality is ingrained into our psyches. Which brings me to the other thing that being made called a whore by a stripper stain, that it's just so sad. Sex work stigma, the negative connotations, the misogyny, the double standards and slut shaming are reasons many women who have other options avoid associating with it. This leads to a vicious cycle. When sex work is dominated by people who think they have no other options, you're going to see a lot of bad behaviour and self-destruction. Regardless of the reality, the pop culture representation of a sex worker is something went wrong. This further justifies the stigma and ostracisation of sex workers. There's nothing intrinsically damaging about sex work, but the stigma scares away most people who aren't self-destructive. Think of the associations that unfortunately come to our minds when we hear the word prostitute. We think of a streetwalker or of a dirty, drug-addicted vagrant. Sex workers reasonably wish to dissociate from that negative self-image, so instead of challenging the narrative, we proclaim, that's not me, I'm better than that. We strip to pay our medical bills. We flip burgers to save for college. We push bad fragrances on people in department stores. Cold call you about long-distance cell phone providers and hand you a flyer in the mall about water softeners. And we tell ourselves that this isn't who we are, we're better than this. So think back to the structure of indebtedness I was talking about earlier, the indebted citizen. As sex workers, we are engaging in an experience that no one outside the world could even attempt to understand. We share a bond that is the danger we put ourselves in every day, the patriarchal state that we labour under, and the vulnerability that we place ourselves in every time we undress ourselves intellectually, spiritually, and literally. Infighting doesn't serve sex workers. It serves to perpetuate the myths necessary to maintain a misogynistic society. It makes us distrustful and keeps us fighting each other instead of fighting for each other. And it keeps us living in a world where sex workers are socially and institutionally marginalised and discriminated against. It robs us of support from the very industry that we are hated for engaging in. Not only that, it's a beautifully written text, but please remember that this is an 18-year-old girl writing that. Now, it was 1984 that Gayle Rubin published Thinking Sex, Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality. 30 years later, Knox is setting out in a space something shorter than Rubin's 52 pages, that's just a couple of pages, an historical analysis of sex work with closely argued propositions, some excellent turns of phrase to match Rubin's, and a diagramming of sex which supplements and complements Rubin's two famous ones from Thinking Sex. Now we look at one of Rubin's diagrams. Charm circle. Do people know Gayle Rubin's work? No? Okay. You might know it when you see it. Okay, that's the one I want. People say that okay? Yeah? So this is the charm circle where you have like good, normal, natural, or blessed sexuality. Now, good sex is heterosexual, married, monogamous, procreative, non-commercial, in pairs, in a relationship, same generation, in private, no pornography, bodies only, vanilla. So that's in the centre of the circle. Then at the outer limits we have bad sex, which is bad, abnormal, unnatural, damned. Damned sexuality, which is homosexual, unmarried, promiscuous, non-procreative, commercial, alone in groups, casual, cross-generational, in public, pornography, with manufactured objects, and sadomasochistic. So that's what she calls the sex hierarchy. And it's strikingly reminiscent of what Knox is trying to say about the whorearchy within sex work, but also within feminism itself. Now, remembering that Rubin's essay was published in 1984, that it was in the midst of an extremely fraught time, which we now call the sex wars. Rubin, interestingly, was also targeted with death threats, intimidation, threats of violence, rape, and so on. And this was the sex wars of the 1980s, which were around two particular issues, which were anti-pornography and sadomasochism. Now, it's rather surprising that 30 years later that Knox is writing from a position which is embedded in the same sorts of fraught debates and arguments. Not quite an outright war, but an argument about anti-pornography and sadomasochism, or rough sex, or sex which is dominant rather than submissive. Sorry, I've just lost my place. I'll say more about rough sex and kink in a moment. But Rubin's argument, which I'm arguing should be reread in very close detail alongside Belle Knox's, is that feminism just simply wasn't up to the task of explaining or analysing why and the mechanisms for the production and instantiation of these hierarchies. In famously announcing the shift from thinking about gender to thinking about sex, which was often misunderstood, it still is, Rubin was arguing for a radical shift in and development of terminologies, tools and practices which made it possible to for us to think about sex and normativity, and even the coinage of the term heteronormativity. But it also made it possible for the emergence of sexuality studies and queer theory. Because if you can imagine, in 1984, we didn't have the terminologies we have now. Queer theory came along some 6 years later. So in drawing her charm circle, Rubin was outlining a way of addressing what, in another famous phrase, she called the fallacy of misplaced scale. Now, Knox offers us, in her own memorable phrase, the whorearchy, the tools for drawing a charm circle of sex work, of good and bad sex worker, of good and bad work, of permissible and impermissible sex work. And also, she gives us the theoretical optic for considering the fallacy of misplaced scale, which is operative not only within the hierarchies and circles of sex work, but in the broader currents of feminism itself. If Rubin called for thinking of sex in 1984, then Knox is calling for a thinking and rethinking of sex in 2014. And if Rubin's diagramming of the hierarchies of normative and non-heteronormative or non-normative practices, positions, tendencies, orientations allowed us to think through scales of power, oppression, persecution, denunciation and marginalisation, which would eventually take on the name queer theory, then what we imagine Knox's attentions to similar scales of normativity and non-normativity and similar burdens of moralisation and marginalisation be named. So if this set of methodological tools eventually became useful for something called queer theory, what if we drew or mapped on Knox's theoretical framework onto this? What would we call it? And I would propose that we call Knox's pervo theory, or pervert theory, this first proposition. And Rubin was, of course, advocating perversion and deviations from all sorts of normativities. But better than that better than calling it per-vote theory, I would call it per-evo theory, where I have the I in brackets. So peri meaning around, so per-evo, so perversion, but also somewhere around, okay, or about, not quite in the centre, at the periphery of, okay. Now I say this because Knox's position is not only marginal vis-a-vis the sex industry. It's marginal for various reasons. She's a new starlet, she's someone who does rough scenes, she's someone who's interested in kink. Her position is also marginal vis-a-vis the academy. Bear in mind she was a first year student writing these essays. Rubin, as it happened, was also an undergraduate when she wrote her first feminist classic essay, which is called The Trafficking Women. Trafficking Women is another text you should read from the 70s, which prefigures a lot of what Knox is saying about how women become appropriated our possessions, which are to be trafficked between men. And she argues in that text for a revolution, not just in kinship, but for a revolution in feminist theory. Knox is also marginal vis-a-vis feminist and queer theory because she's advocating pleasure, danger, joy, over against the moralising, privilege checking, anti-porn, anti-sex, anti-pleasure, anti-jouissance, slut-shaming, sex trolling of contemporary feminisms. So Knox's peri-vote theory, as I'm calling it, is a perversion of contemporary feminisms, which I'm going to call mean girls feminisms, trademark. Okay? So I'm coining mean girls feminisms, and they are the types of feminism which police who is in and who is out, who can be feminist and who cannot, who can be queer and who cannot, what counts as good sex and what counts as bad, who counts as a good girl and who does not, what counts as a good boy and who does not, who counts as a male feminist and who does not, who is at the centre and who is at the periphery, what practices are at the centre and what practices or acts are at the circumference or the peripheries of both feminism and queer theory. So Knox's is in two senses what I will call fucking feminism. Okay. So we've got peri-vote theory, mean girls feminism, and now fucking feminism. Now fucking feminism, I would suggest, is an unapologetically sex positive, as in positive about all sex. It's an unapologetically sex positive position, and it fucks with mean girl or killjoy feminisms of all sorts and all stripes. With the emergence in the third wave of ever faster, more stroboscopic feminisms on blogs, Twitter, Instagram, Vine, Snapchat, and other social media, which has simply led to greater and more immediate shaming of feminists who are revolting in every sense, Knox ushers in a fourth wave. Now, the fourth wave has already been coined, but it's been coined, as I've discovered, to refer to the kinds of feminisms I would reject and would see Knox and other sex-positive theorists as revolting against. It's all this privilege-checking feminism, which is like, you're not one of us, you're not one of us, that's bad sex, you shouldn't be doing that. So, the fourth wave, as I see it, is certainly one which happens with greater immediacy, because it's largely online. But when we think of waves, we don't necessarily need to think of the waves of feminism as overlapping or superseding one another, so that the first wave is replaced by the second, and the third replaces the second, and then the fourth replaces the third. I would see them rather as like radio frequencies or radio waves, okay? So that we might instead suggest that Knox is tuning into certain frequencies. So she's tuning into Rubin's work, which is from the second wave, and she's extrapolating a new paradigm from that. Then she's tuning into or turning up the volume on something like Eve Sedgwick's work from the 90s, Epistemology of the Closet and Tendencies, which had all these lists and axioms which were about positions and orientations and tendencies which people could take up. And she's, in several respects, she's adding to those lists and recreating a different paradigm for the 20-teens, as we would call our current moment. So in several respects, I would see this stroboscopic feminism, which highlights new issues and concerns, as one which is written for or tailored towards, again, another coinage, the pericariat, right? Which isn't the precariat, because there are also scales of precariousness. Okay, so the pericariat are on the completely outer limits. Those who are at the margins theoretically, institutionally, as workers, as subjects, as citizens, as intellectuals. Now, Knox is a fast feminist in Shannon Bell's sense, insofar as she fucks, she writes, she fucks with feminist orthodoxies, she squirts, she writes with her cum. She doesn't just write feminism, she does it. And like feminine, and like she was further denounced as someone researching male sexual practices, particularly gay male sexual practices, such as fisting, as if fisting were only a gay male sexual practice. But this is what I'm talking about, what counts as belonging to certain feminists. Now, in the face of the regressions, as I would see it, of feminism to arguments about who is included and who is not, Knox advocates modes of collective crafting and solidarity, compassion and shared endeavour, work that can only really be done from a pericarious position or posture at the margins of institutional power. It's only those who are, as you said yesterday, and those who are at the bottom who care about shifting paradigms. Why would feminists with power want to, really? Yeah. I saw an article the other day, I think it might be in The Guardian, about the triumph of third-wave feminism is really that women have more shoes. So it's saying that, you know, feminism of the third wave was really just about consumerism. In what Beatriz Preciado calls the pharmacopornographic era, Knox eschews the phallic power of the Killjoy girls and exuberantly takes up the phallus, but in a way which is a copyleft kind of feminism. Copyleft in that it can't become copyrighted, it can't become the sort of canonised, celebritized, too often cited feminism of the Mean Girls. But Knox just doesn't give a fuck, and why should she? Pervo-feminists or perigo-feminists shouldn't. The task is not about deciding who is in and who is out, but rather, with Knox, of creating pornotopic spaces for promiscuous thought, for more and more ways of doing things together, more and more ways of fucking things up together. The perigo-feminist needs a new toolbox, and I have been arguing for new modes of reading, many of which I think Knox is engaging in with her hopeful and non-teleological projects. I call these new attentive reading practices pericritical modes. I call them pericritical because they are close reading practices which are pericritical in the sense that they are written from the margins of orthodox, canonical, critical positions. But they are also eroticized critical practices. So far I've written about cruising, fingering, rimming, fisting, flirting and teasing as the pericritical or peri-aesthetical modes. And the kinds of people I see as perigo theorists are ones for whom queer and feminism are about crafting new modes, are about self-poiesis, and they are about becoming toward others rather than excluding others. And these theorists very often are people who write themselves into the texts, are ethnographers of sex. They don't just write about theory, they also fuck with theory or fuck with the theory that they're doing. Gayle Rubin, as well as Gayle Rubin and Belle Knox. Tim Dean would be a good example. He writes about the barebacking subculture, but also talks about engaging in practice of barebacking. Shannon Bell, who wrote a book called Fast Feminism, she talks about female ejaculation, but she also does it on stage and she produces photographs of it and writes text describing it and how to do it. Wayne Kostenbaum, who's a poet but also a theorist, who writes about his own sexual practices. Joanna Frua, a feminist, who writes about her own radical sex practices and also feminist theory. Marie Calloway, who's part of the alt-lit movement, again writes about her own sexual practices in ways which fuck with not only gender and sexuality but also with genre. Her texts appear as like instant messages or on an iPhone screen. text messages, so she plays her own form. And then Beatriz Preciado. These, for me, are the shining or glittering examples of feminisms or queer theories which are committed to keeping things dirty, to be revolting in the multiple sense of that term. Okay, so my last section is what I call slug feminism. More provocatively, given that Knox has been subjected to slut shaming from not just her fellow students and online, but also from fellow feminists, seemingly fellow feminists and seemingly fellow sex workers, might we call her brand of feminism, which could never become a brand or a cult like the Mean Girls feminisms, might we call it slut feminism? Why not? Let's look at an article by her on slut shaming and kink. Okay, so I'm going to find this for you. This was written for XOJ, which he's written several articles for. Okay. Again, I'm going to... Zoinks, there's a problem. Why is there a problem? There wasn't that article earlier. Let's see if that links to it. Okay, this isn't it. Anyway, the proper link is that one. But I'm going to read it anyway. And here's the strap line that she gives to it. Kink does not disqualify me as a feminist, no matter how many concerned trolling essays are written. Okay, so this is from March last year. I just cut and pasted it and I've got all the ads on my screen, so I've got to scroll down through them. And I can't read it off the screen, unfortunately. Okay, I've found it at last. This is quite a similar essay to the previous one. It came with a trigger warning, so I should repeat the trigger warning. Although trigger warning feminism is the kind of mean girl feminism I would argue against, but I will repeat it.
Does it work?
No, the link must be broken.
The link.
But I'm just going to...
Just check.
I'm going to read it anyway, but here's the trigger warning.
The link is fine. The link.
No, it's not the internet.
No, it's not the internet, it's just the link. But anyway, I'm going to read her words. But the warning is that this article discusses self-harm, so please read with caution. Okay. So if anybody is worried about self-harm, then that's okay. I'm a habitual self-harmer, so I feel very great affinity with Knox when she describes this. So life is neither black nor white when it comes to sex, which is interesting in terms of the diagram. We play around with roles and identities while we are working out issues that are long burned in our subconscious. I'll just go back to Rubin. Just to keep it in mind. We play around with roles and identities while we are working out issues that are long buried in our subconscious. I'm an ambitious young woman, I'm a student at Duke, I'm a slut who needs to be punished. Can you guess which one of those is a role? Ever since I was a child, I've had some masochistic tendencies. When I was a young girl and my friend and I would play house, I would ask her to lock me in her dog cage. I was not fully aware of it, but it physically and mentally aroused me. I didn't know why, but I liked it. Suddenly I found myself in an entirely different role. I felt for the first time what it was like to be helpless and trapped. It was exciting. It was different. I can't explain why rough sex and pain arouses me. It just does. Before I had a legitimate porn agent, I heard about a website that paid well but was psychologically extreme. I don't want to give them any more publicity by using their name. I could handle it, I thought. Honestly, when I arrived at the small studio in New York where I filmed my scene for a few hours, and after I signed away all my rights to claim any subsequent trauma that might arise from filming the scene, I thought that my decision to do a scene with this notoriously rough sex website was daring, badass, even subversive. For me, it was an experiment of going to yet another scary sexual place, except I was in control. I was calling the shots and the safe words, and I was the one choosing to do something so psychologically and physically extreme, rather than someone taking advantage of me. I love rough sex and I can do this. That's what I saw the choice as being. Now I view it as the one choice I would take back if I could as a porn actress. The more I read criticism of the site, the more I realised that if I do another rough sex scene, I will more thoroughly research the company and how they treat their performance. But I also don't think having participated in this single experience should define me, the same way I don't believe sex should define women in general. We as performers have rights to express ourselves, and as long as everything is consensual and legal, then more power to everyone involved. The overwhelming criticism I have received for my participation in this rough blowjob scene is incredibly revealing to me about the condemnation or happy state of gotcha feminism. Again, a memorable phrase from Belle for what I call mean girls feminism. I've been called a hypocrite and mocked for daring to talk about empowerment if I have also not kept adequately hidden away my enjoyment of rough and dirty, nasty and filthy, saliva dripping and name-calling filled sex. So getting spayed on and degraded is feminism now? Wrote one poster on collegiate ISSH-Skopje. Sure, whatever choice a woman is making and she is the one deciding to do, reclaiming the agency behind the decision to do, even if it is a degrading sexual act, is absolutely feminism. To me, feminism is about women not being shamed, but rather being empowered. You can dress up your critical essays with me saying that I deserve to be disowned by my parents and kicked out of school, however you like, but all of these hit pieces are about one particularly anti-feminist notion: shame. But you know what? Shame is your issue, not mine. You can write thousands of words about how sexual acts I have done must define me because I am a woman and I have a vagina. But to me, feminism means that I do not need to hold down my head because you tell me that that's exactly what I should be doing. Yes, a Google search reveals pictures of me in hardcore sexual experiences. No, that Google search is not me. I am me. Feminists can possibly enjoy rough sex, right? This is completely paradoxical. A woman cannot preach feminist empowerment during the day and at night participate in what we have constructed to be stereotypically submissive behaviour. Why is that? Why is it that we have to adhere to the ascribed gender roles of patriarchy? These critics are missing the bigger picture of feminism, perhaps the most important, where women support other women, even the ones who enjoy mascara smeared on your knees fellatio. To be a feminist is not to say that everything submissive should be rejected. It is simply to say that you should not feel pressure to adhere to canonized ideas of gender. People attack feminism by saying a feminist who enjoys submission, even degradation, in the bedroom is upholding patriarchy. But if she likes dominance, then she is trying to be like a man. But the greatest sin I seem to have committed of all in this entire scandal is that I have admitted to enjoying rough sex. Why? Because I am supposed to keep it a secret, shrouded in shame? Perhaps most telling of some of the criticism I've received is that I'm an emotionally disturbed little girl. Infantilization of me as a little girl aside, the implication seems to be that if you are a woman and openly sexual, you must be crazy. Because women are supposed to be docile and only sexual in certain circumstances, correct. If I'm not adhering to these societal norms and instead I'm sexual and kinky and brazen about it, then what could possibly be wrong with me? Be a lady in the streets and a freak between the sheets. That's the trick, isn't it? I would say that's part of the reason that I wanted to do a rough porn scene, to take ownership of my fantasies. The truth is, my favourite adult genre is rough blowjob porn. I find it incredibly arousing. My fantasies in the bedroom are only about what arouses me, which is completely unrelated to gender roles, feminism, or my value and worth as a woman or a human being. The truth is, if a woman fantasizes about being dominated and degraded, it does not mean she actually wants or deserves to be dominated and degraded in real life, all caps. It does not mean she deserves to be name-called, even though during a sexual act, that might be the exact thing that turns her on. Feminism means I can take ownership of what I enjoy sexually, and that sexuality does not have to determine anything else about me. You might, but I would not, because feminism is not a one-size-fits-all movement. The way I see it, there is an unfortunate and significant schism in our movement between the sex-negative feminists, women who believe that sex, especially pornography, is degrading and imbued with power struggles, and sex-positive, pro-kink, pro-fetish feminists, women like me who believe that sexual liberation is paramount to achieving progress and equality. Over the years, the BDSM community has been marginalised from the mainstream. We're called freaks. Submissives are labelled as victims of abuse. They must be emotionally disturbed to enjoy being tied up and choked. We rationalise. Submissive feminists have it even worse. The community that we identify with dismisses our desires or pegs us as unwitting victims. We are told that we're part of a social dynamic that seeks to violate all women. Is there a difference between positive kink and negative, even dangerous kink? Yes, I believe so. And as I have said, if I could take back my first porn scene on that notorious rough sex website, I would. But I would not, and I will never, take back my love of kink. When I agreed to film that rough sex scene, I knew what was in store for me. I knew that it was a game of psychological degradation as much as physical. I knew as it was unfolding, and I saw exactly how they were trying to break me. I realised that the visual of me with a facial at the end was nothing compared to the close-up the site provided of my skin, revealing scars from my most vulnerable past when I was a cutter. This is a fact that my haters have taunted me with, their words dripping in condescension and insensitivity. I've been clean from this self-harm for 5 years now, but like many young women grappling with depression, I used to take it out on myself. For anyone who has this issue, I encourage them to seek help immediately and to not feel ashamed. You are okay. Your self-harm does not define you. Get help. You are loved, and you can get past this. Please call the self-harm hotline at 1-800-DON'T-CUT. Does my admission that I cut when I was a teenager suddenly make me the porn stereotype of depressed, crazy kid? I would say it's the exact opposite. I have nothing to hide. People from all walks of life have engaged in self-harm, from celebrities to politicians to models to porn stars. I honestly believe it is often the people who will not show you their demons who have the worst ones to hide. I'm not going to apologise for getting turned on by embracing an archetypal submissive role during sex. The same way that a powerful CEO businessman likes to visit a dominatrix in his off hours, I'm not ashamed to admit that I enjoy the pleasure derived from these rough scenes. It provides a cave woman-like epiphany that no intro to feminist studies ever will. It is raw and exhilarating, but that's my choice, which is what matters here. I know it is not for every woman. As a strong, assertive young woman, sometimes it's fun to reverse roles and play around with my personality. I can be psychoanalysed in a million different ways, but sometimes there's just no rhyme or reason. I like what I like, and I won't live in shame because of it. Do I regret shooting a scene with this website? Yes. Do I think I deserve to be demonised for it? Absolutely not. As I have learned more about the BDSM community, I have let myself become educated about safe, sane and consensual BDSM, which exists as a polar opposite of a reality in which women constantly face the threat of sexual violence. BDSM is all about consent. Abuse is all about a lack thereof. Our perceptions of the BDSM and rough sex community are rife with misconceptions. The notion of consent is taken very seriously in the BDSM community. This is why we establish safe words and signals and lay out all of our boundaries beforehand. As problematic as this one rough sex website is, the scene I participated in was no exception. We decided on hand signals, and I knew that I could stop at any time. I was entirely in control, something that could be viewed as a refreshing difference from the far too common sexual torment and abuse women are subjected to on a daily basis. A comment on one personal BDSM website describes this notion of consent in the world of kink perfectly. The author writes, "There is a fundamental difference between doing something out of psychological torment, rage, terror, desolation, hate, and doing something out of joy, connection, fun, affection, love. That the logistics of giving and obeying an order, of binding and being bound, of an object hitting flesh, might superficially resemble each other is irrelevant. Sexuality is a beautiful, fluid thing. It reveals our vulnerability and humanity. There is an entire range of sexual preferences, and as long as the activity is consensual, legal and mutually beneficial, I feel we should embrace them. I believe that women can be goddesses in the bedroom as well as in the boardroom. Maybe you getting a facial sounds completely degrading to you, and that's perfectly fine, but to me it gets me off. And the fact that it gets me off does not mean it has to hold me back. As the wonderfully kinky and intelligent Sasha Grey once said, what one person sees as degrading and disgusting and bad for women might make some women feel empowered and beautiful and strong. So no, Time magazine, I actually am as empowered as I think, but thank you for your concern. So, conclusion now. Rubin's still powerful opening exhortation in Thinking Sex, that the time had come to think about sex, is something Knox is wrestling with for our present moment. It is really hard to believe that the 1970s and 1980s sex panics around porn and BDSM are replaying themselves in our contemporary feminist moment, and that we are still in want of what Rubin called for a more radical theory of sex, which would centralise sexuality's centrality to politics and challenge the operations of privilege and stigma that then, and clearly still now, structure the ways we think about sex. We fall on either one side or the other of the good or bad and bad sex wall, or the one. We either fall in the centre or at the periphery of the circle. Knox reminds us in the present moment how much political and theoretical traction Rubin's work still has. The sexual rabble that Rubin assembled inside and outside her charm circle and on either side of her good and bad sex walls was as expansive as could be. But Knox demonstrates acutely how the sexual rabble of sex workers, the promiscuous, the unmarried, the non-procreative, the single, the cross-generational, are still situated at the outer limits of sexual acceptability and respectability. As Laurie Penny argues in Unspeakable Things, slut power means speaking up or speaking back, reclaiming and alchemizing a term of insult and censure, and turning slut, like crip and queer, into a term of valorization and shamelessness. Slut is, Penny says, a word that desperately needs to be taken back. Knox grabs slut and whore with both hands for feminism, and with Penny extends the categories of the sexual rabble to include poor women fucking, black women fucking, queer women fucking, old women fucking, fat women fucking, ugly women fucking, bossy, arrogant women fucking, women who are dominant in men, women who like to penetrate men with big pink strap-ons, women who want multiple sex partners at once or in succession, women who just want to go to bed early with a cup of tea, an Anna Span DVD and a spiked dildo the size of an eggplant, sex workers who want to be treated like workers rather than social pariahs, men who want to get fucked, men who are gentle and submissive in bed, men who don't enjoy penetrative sex, men for whom sex is an overwhelming emotional experience. I guarantee you that all of these things go on, but any of them might actually destabilise for a second our cultural narratives of sex, gender and power, so none of them are allowed to be trends. The time then has come to think about slug feminism. And to conclude, in a metonymical pop shot, I would like to substitute the improper name Belle Knox for the word sex in the famous opening paragraph of Rubin's essay Thinking Sex. The time has come to think about Belle Knox. To some, Belle Knox may seem to be an unimportant topic, a frivolous diversion from more critical problems of poverty, war, racism, famine, or nuclear annihilation. But it's precisely at times such as these, when people live with the possibility of unthinkable destruction, that people are likely to become dangerously crazy about Belle Knox. Contemporary conflicts over Belle Knox's values and erotic conduct have much in common with the religious disputes of earlier centuries. They acquire immense symbolic weight. Disputes over Belle Knox's behaviour often become the vehicles for displacing social anxieties and discharging their attendant emotional intensity. Consequently, Belle Knox should be treated with special respect in times of great social stress. Okay, thank you.